Welcome back, my beautiful friends. You're listening to A Moment of Zen right here on 710 WOR, the voice of New York. I'm your host, Zen Sands. Now, up next in our Business and Buzz segment, we have returning contributor Kyle Wool, president of Revere Securities. Now, Revere Securities is a leading emerging growth-focused broker-dealer serving many industries globally, thanks in large part to Kyle's leadership, energy, and tenacity. And today, Kyle and I are chatting with Joe Pinion. Now, Joe Pinion was designated the New York Republican Party's official challenger for Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer's U.S. Senate seat at the party's convention this past February. Now, Joe is the first Black man to run for U.S. Senate in New York, and he's a Yonkers native and former political news commentator with Newsmax. Now, there are just under 180 days left until the 2022 elections, and Joe is hoping to use each of those to flip a safe blue seat held by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer to red. And recently, Joe took aim at Chuck, one of the nation's most powerful senators, for his inability to repeal the cap on the state and local tax deduction, otherwise known as SALT. Now, the cap had been fully deductible prior to the year 2017, and it was fiercely opposed by New Yorkers, especially those who live in high property tax areas of the state. And Chuck Schumer, who is supposed to be this very powerful man in the United States Senate, has failed to deliver those SALT deductions that make the middle class living affordable for New Yorkers. Now, the cap on SALT was one of the strategies used by President Trump to pay for tax cuts back in 2017. Here to chat some more are Joe and Kyle. Welcome to the show, superstars.
Good to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, thank you, Zen.
Good. Nice to see you both, my friends. Okay, Joe, I'm going to start with you. Very excited to dive right in, given the current economy. Now, New York elected officials are basically scrambling to spin their disastrous population losses as something that can easily be reversed. And the truth is that New York millionaires and billionaires generate most of the city's and state's tax revenues, and rich people were willing to pay high taxes and subsidize this excess because the Big Apple was still the cultural center of the world, and because under mayors Rudy Giuliani and even Mike Bloomberg, the streets remained safe. Also, it didn't hurt that rich New Yorkers could also deduct much of their city and state tax payments from their federal levies. Now, the SALT cap has been a pain for high tax states because residents cannot deduct more than $10,000 in state and local levies on their federal returns. What is going on here, Joe?
Well, look, I'll take it a step further. Yes, we do have the well-to-do that have been pulling the wagon when it comes to the tax levies that help keep New York moving. But the problem is that, to your point, when shootings go up 90%, when homicide goes up 30%, when you're dealing with the fact that we have Jewish people being beaten in Times Square. We just had another Jewish person who was struck by teenagers yesterday. Police officers being shot. Another police officer shot yesterday. People who have the means take their means and they go other places where they can feel safe, where the quality of life is enjoyable. And so what is left is a decimated middle class that now no longer has that one tool at the disposal, those SALT cap deductions that allow them to have that middle class affordable living. And so that is what we've seen all across this state. 1 million people have fled the state of New York. We lead the nation in outward migration. We lost another congressional seat. So our power in DC is waning. The influence of the middle class and the size of the middle class is falling. And the person who has accumulated power in our name, Senator Charles Ellis Schumer, he continues to climb the ranks, and we are the ones that are left to suffer while he tries to build a utopia that only exists and works on paper.
Very true and very well said. And this ties directly into the markets, and Kyle is going to pipe in here. But when you have street giants beginning to open offices in places like Florida and Texas with no state income tax, and the rush for the exits continue, it's a grave, it's a grave outlook here. And census figures show that through 2019, that millionaires have been leaving New York at an alarming pace. So Kyle, I'll turn this to you. It doesn't hurt that rich New Yorkers could also deduct much of their city and state tax payments from their federal levies, like we've said, but they got a tax break by stocking away their wealth in tax-free municipal bonds. Now, there's a place where reality can't easily be spun, and that's the munis. So municipal bonds don't often follow the same set of rules as other types of debt, which rise and fall based on broad economic trends and interest rates. Municipal bonds are a tax haven, and even when rates rise and other bonds fall, rich people in high tax places like New York can often be counted on to keep buying city and state debt. But the appeal is eroding, according to stats. And the only explanation is a growing number of rich people who no longer need to seek New York munis as a tax haven because they now live in Florida. What do you say to this, and what is it doing to the current markets?
Well, first of all, it's an honor to be on this show with Joe, and I think most of myself and my friends in Wall Street will help support him in his candidacy for the United States Senate. When you
Yes.
love to meet you soon, Joe. Anyway, when you talk to municipal bonds, right? Municipal bonds have to be looked at in a variety of different ways. You have, in a state like Florida, you can buy municipal bonds and you'll have a national tax-free, so you just don't pay federal taxes. But when you're in a high-tax state, in a high-tax city like New York City, we have federal tax, we have state tax, and then we have city tax. And if you're in the top earning bracket, which in a place like New York City, which the standard of living is so high, you can reach that top earning bracket pretty quick for a married couple. $500,000 or around that can get you to that bracket. So now you're talking about almost 12% difference between federal when you add into state and local. So traditionally, like you just said, Zen, people would buy New York City bridges and tunnels. People would buy SUNY university tax municipal bonds where they would get a triple tax-free ability. So therefore, if you could get 5%, that would come in tax-free. But also what you're saying, when you see a lot of these hedge fund billionaires and private equity billionaires relocating down to Palm Beach, Boca Raton, Miami, and you're seeing wirehouses like my former employee, Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan, setting up wealth centers in Palm Beach and in Brickell and North Miami, you're starting to take these people that probably funded these bridges and tunnels in New York State universities and just giving up and moving to Florida. So I do think there is an issue on the horizon.
Yeah, actually, well said. You know what? That perspective is actually very unique, and of course, it takes somebody like on yourself on the wealth management side to really give us that perspective. So, thank you for that, Joe. I'm going to flip this one back to you now. The Bear Traps report is a research platform crunched some numbers for me and came up with the following: yields on Florida municipal bonds have often been higher than those from New York because there was more demand for the Empire State debt, so to speak, like Kyle just put it, and less demand for tax-free bonds in low states like Florida. That began to shift over the years, but most significantly in early February of this year, New York bond yields are higher than Florida's, just as the New York State's rich residents' tax base has significantly thinned. How do you plan on fixing this?
Well, look, I think twofold. I think first and foremost, we have to be honest with the American people about how we got in this mess in the first place. When you look at the downward slope of New York, you have a regulatory environment that is monstrous, whether you're talking about people that are trying to basically capitalize on an emerging market like crypto. New York is the most hostile environment for something like crypto. If you're looking at just an environment where businesses want to come and put down roots, you don't have to look any further than Amazon with the disaster that was there, where Senator Chuck Schumer put his head in the sand, allowed a freshman member of Congress named Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to run Amazon out of town, and the jobs that go along with it. They're banging the table talking about mandatory minimum wage, fight for 15, free college. Come to find out that Amazon is voluntarily providing to their employees much of the things that they are in the streets complaining about. And so this is what happens when you have a lack of leadership, that it goes beyond the actual legislation that is passed. It actually creates an environment that is so toxic that the job creators no longer want to be here, that the people who have been creating jobs in New York State and New York City for generations upon generations have finally decided to pick up roots, pick up stakes, and go to other places that actually want their business, actually appreciate the influx of opportunity that they provide for their local economy. So that is the first step. The next step, again, passing legislation at the federal level that, again, doesn't necessarily, not legislation, but leveraging the power of the federal purse to incentivize local municipalities to do the right thing, right? What the federal government lacks in oversight, they certainly can make up for in influence with those federal dollars. And so I always say, do not allow municipalities to be held to a lower standard than the private sector. You look at something as basic as public housing. The largest slumlord in America is not a millionaire or billionaire, as Bernie Sanders might have you believe. It's New York City public housing, $40 billion in the rears. If
Yeah.
you or I owned public housing in New York City, you would actually be in prison. You'd be called a slumlord. 500,000 souls live there. And so, issue by issue, agency by agency, we fund the despair. That despair, in many ways, degrades the appeal of people who want to invest in things like New York City, who want to invest in those local municipalities. So again, making sure there is accountable for the neglect that causes the despair, I think is one way to make the investment in America and in local cities and local states like New York an appealing option again for
Well
investors who
said.
are looking for a place to
Well
put their
said.
money.
Yep, that you said that perfectly. And Kyle, I'm sure is eager to pipe in here, but this unfair cap, if you go back to even this this unfair cap has already placed a significant financial burden on countless hardworking middle class families in New York and the years to come. And it's expected to cost New York taxpayers more than 100 billion. And the governor currently has argued that the 10,000 limit was a politically motivated provision by former President Donald Trump. So, an administration aimed at mostly Democratic-led states, right? That we this provision, so to speak. What do you say to this, Kyle and Joe? I want you to both answer that question.
I'm going to answer that based on experience of where I grew up, and I know Joe right now is campaigning up in Rochester, New York, and my sister and my family live in Fairport, New York, which is a suburb of Rochester.
We were just at the Fairport Educational Alliance last night, so yeah, there you go.
Yep, and there you go. And I grew up in the Finger Lake region, just outside of Ithaca, where my mother was a social worker. And one of the things I noticed by growing up upstate New York, which I'm very worried about with downstate New York, is when they started to overtax upstate New York, you started to have a mass migration of people that would move down to North Carolina, South Carolina, where you had lower taxes, you had better jobs. And then most of the people who grew up in upstate New York, unless you were a doctor or a lawyer or a teacher, there weren't these kind of jobs as Lockheed Martin left, as General Electric left, right? Now I'm seeing the same thing, which scares me because I love New York City. I'm seeing the same thing in here in downstate New York, where they're going after these hedge funds, these Wall Street guys that have created billions in revenue, created ancillary jobs. And like you mentioned, Amazon, I won't get into too much of how it's actually just a $4 million tax credit and you have $21 billion in investment, or $1 billion. And then you have all the ancillary jobs around where you have food trucks and plumbers and unions, everybody that would have made a tremendous amount of money in Long Island City. We're not going to go to there. But I do understand your point, and I agree with it 110%. But my point is, if you start to overtax your base, you will drive people out of New York City. And then how do you fix that? And you could have a scenario like we had in the late 70s and 1980s, where the city just falls apart. And I think that would be scary, not only for us, not only for New Yorkers, but for the whole world that loves the uniqueness that is New York City.
Okay, yes, exactly. Joe, we have about a minute left, but when we go back to answer this question specifically with the accusation that this provision by former President Donald Trump's administration was aimed at mostly Democratic-led states, what do you say to this? You have about a minute.
Look, I often say I'm running for United States Senate to represent the interest of the people of New York State and to do what's best in the long-term interest of America. It's certainly in the long-term interest of America and New York State to make sure that we have a vibrant middle class. You cannot have a vibrant middle class in New York State when people are afraid to buy a home because of the tax implications, or people who have a home cannot afford to keep it. So that to me is the issue. And I think even again, to my colleague's point, if you look at what's happening all across this state, look at what happened in Detroit. Where the auto industry falls apart, and you see the rot and despair. Look at what happened in Rochester when the Kodaks left town, in Buffalo when you look at all the industries that left town, Syracuse when Carrier reduces its size dramatically. That is the type of rot that leads to despair, that leads to hollowed out towns and cities all across the landscape. If you don't think it can happen in New York, you're just not paying attention. We are on the brink. We need better leadership. We need better stewardship. And that has to start right now.
There you go. Well, thank you so much, both of you. Very insightful Business and Buzz segment. Kyle, thank you so much for coming on. Always a pleasure having you, my friend.
Thank you, Zen.
Joe, thank you so much for coming on. It's very, very refreshing to hear your perspective on things, and I'm sending you all the best of luck.
All the luck, and then people can go to joepinion.com and help
That's
us get across the finish line. So
that's
that's the
right.
important part.
JoePinion.com is the place where people can go exactly to learn more about Joe and his quest to give people a chance to have a choice here in New York for the U.S. Senate for the first time in close to 24 years. Head to JoePinion.com and definitely check out Revere Securities, RevereSecurities.com. That was our Business and Buzz segment brought to you by Revere Securities. You're listening to A Moment of Zen right here on 710 WOR, the voice of New York. We'll be right back after this.